To our conference, as I said, that we have, ISPI has organized with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Asia Society France. Philippe Lacour is not here yet, he's coming, he's on the subway. Thanks to Philippe, we will thank you again when you reach us very soon. And so far, in this series on the G7, we have addressed topics like cybersecurity, debt, trade, logistic, but I dare to say that today's topic is possibly even more crucial. Because indeed, the rise of the Global South is one of the most critical dynamics of the international system. Myself, I think I've been involved in the last 2 years in at least 10 panels on the Global South. I think I only talk about Global South recently, so there is no other topic I get involved for some reason, maybe because I have a house in Sicily. But what is exactly the Global South is still being debated. Are China and Russia really to be considered part of the Global South? But let's be honest, talking about the Global South also means discussing a contested global leadership. Is the West about to lose its leadership? And what do you know about the plans of countries like China and India that are striving to lead the emerging world? Of course, we know China better because Xi Jinping, for over a decade, has been telling the world and everyone that he wants his country to be a leader. And we also know that a Chinese superpower is no longer something belonging to the future, is already a reality. And although most of us, most in the West, panic and tries to contain Beijing economically and politically, we must acknowledge that without China, the world would not be able to achieve anything that resembles to a green transition in the short run. And that's why at ISPI we are always very, we are underlying very often the need to be on issue like de-risking or tariff rush, to be very pragmatic and to meditate carefully before taking any big policy decision. Moving to India. The world has only just started to know India. It is clearly regarded as a clear winner of the post-Ukraine international scenario, as a friend-shoring location par excellence. But how long will it last? This is something I keep asking to my Indian friends. How long will it last? How long will Modi's increasingly autocratic and personalistic style, how long will it be regarded as like-minded by the West? And what about something we keep repeating as well, what about India's ties to Russia? Therefore, what to do? How can the West deal with the rising Global South? And again, we need to be very pragmatic. We believe that the Global North needs to understand that the Global South countries are raising legitimate requests. And in turn, the Global South needs to recognize that the current international architecture dominated by the Washington Consensus has also allowed developing countries to grow and escape poverty. We should start from what we already have and make it more equal. But what does specifically the G7 have to do with the Global South? What do the G7 and the Global South should do together? It's clear that the G7 urgently needs to find a way to collaborate with the Global South. It will be tough, let's be honest. All the champions of multilateralism are not exactly champions of multilateralism when it comes to the Global South. And still, the Global North already cooperated constructively with the Global South at least once when we created together the G20 in 2009-2010. So What are the lessons learned since the creation of the G20 that the G7 should adopt while engaging with the Global South? This is something our panels will discuss in depth today, but let me just say one word, one recipe, one simple recipe. We should start to cooperate on low priorities, on low devices issues, for example, fiscal rules for multinational, infrastructure, investment needs, development, to fight distrust, and then gradually, brick to brick, move up. This is something European countries within the G7 have learned over the last 70 years. This is something we could adopt also in dealing with the Global South. But I'm now very glad to leave the floor to Filippo and to the other colleagues which are in this panel. Filippo will moderate session number 1, Global South as China sees it. Filippo.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you everybody for being here with us. Thank you also for those connected online. I'm honored to start this session. So we can see our friend Yu Jie from Chatham House being in London today, and He Zhigao from Beijing, from CAS. Thank you, Yu Jie, and thank you, He Zhigao, for being with us. Here in Milan, we have Linda Calabrese from ODI. She came from London as well, but so we are glad you are here with us, and Alessia Ameghini from ISPI. So let's start with this topic. As Paolo said, Global South probably is one of the most important issues in international relations, and as we do know, China is one of the top actors in it. But even if, correctly Paolo said, we know China better, we probably don't know exactly what China is doing and what they want to do regarding the Global South. So I will start giving the floor to He Zhigao in Beijing, asking him to stay in 4 minutes if he can, asking him how important is the Global South to China?
Hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you for inviting me here, and it's my great pleasure to discuss this topic with you all. I'm so sorry I could not attend the conference personally in Milano. Regarding for this topic, firstly, I have 3 words about Global South. First, Global South. The term of the Global South is overwhelming. What's the meaning of overwhelming? That's why we talk about this topic in this conference, and I also noticed that many conferences touching upon this topic, Global South. That's why we are here to talk about Global South as well as G7, because the G7 will be holding in Italy. Now the academic circle and politicians and think tanks talk many times about Global South, but what's the real meaning of the Global South? That leads to my second word, overstretched. As a researcher, we talk about the theory or methods. We always know that the term or the conception is concise, is much better, but the Global South is overstressed. Now it's kind of narrative. There's battle of narratives. For example, different countries have different ideas about Global South. So that leads to my third term. Global South is overlapping. What's the meaning of the overlapping? So sometimes we talk about the developing countries, sometimes we talk about Global South, and as well as the 77 groups, as well as the third world. So that's overlapping. So that's why my general ideas about the Global South regarding for the importance to China. Based on the official statement, the Global South is a group of emerging countries and developing countries. And China is one member, of this group. That's the official statement. In China now, there's still many researchers publish articles on this topic. For me, the importance of this term to China, there are three levels. First, they have similar historical experience, especially in terms of imperialism and colonialism. Second, in terms of economic development, China and Global South are developing countries. Even now, there are some different ideas on developing status of China, but still now China and the Global South are developing countries. Regarding for the third level, I call the relation perspective. China view Global South is from the inside, not from outside. That's the difference between China and the Western countries' perspective on this term.
Thank you. Rogeo. Thank you so much for this perspective from Beijing. Actually, you correctly, I think, say that so the issue Global South is very much of a stretch, and then from China's point of view, there are 3 points: historical, economical, and relational. The fact that China is part of the Global South, or at least China presents itself as part of the Global South. So I will ask now Alessia Meghini, who recently also published for us a policy paper on China and Global South. Alessia, so from your point of view, from the point of view of a researcher, a scholar, so how would you frame the China-Global South relationship?
Yes, thanks Filippo, and thanks Jigao for introducing the Chinese perspective on the Global South concept, which is indeed what I tried to dig into in this policy paper just out, I think, some weeks ago. You can find it on the website. And the very first message that I would like to share is that the Global South has no definition whatsoever. So in Beijing, they call it some way, and in the West, we consider it another way, and there is no official definition of Global South. If you consider that from one paper back in the 90s, mentioning Global South, to 1,600 papers a couple of years ago mentioning Global South. Not even one of them has a definition of Global South. So everybody's talking about, kind of whatever they consider it to be, but different from the others. This is a very, I think, important point from where to start, because especially considering the relations between China and the Global South. China has its own definition of Global South, and the relations between China and the Global South have been evolving as long as China has positioned and repositioned herself vis-à-vis the South, what was called the South of the world, now Global South, with a number of diplomatic actions and strategies, from bilateral traditional diplomacy to multilateral diplomacy in the UN system, the traditional ways to interact with other countries, to more what we could call collective diplomacy or group diplomacy now, since the very early 21st century. And even more so since 2013, when the BRI, the Belt and Road, started as a massive exercise in group diplomacy, involving the developing world, but increasingly also countries that are included in what China considers as being her global south, which includes countries, of course, not in the south, geographically speaking, of the world. So say Hungary. Well, you should not be surprised that Hungary is in the global south, but of course we consider it not to be in the global south. So there is a conceptual and issue first. I think this should come first, of course, because what are we talking about if we don't define the term? Anyway, I did some research here. So the relations have been changing with the ultimate aim to have China as a leader of the global south. So this is why in the UN system, in UN resolutions also, or in the division in the UN, in the Fifth Avenue documents, you have all groupings of developing countries starting back many years ago with the G77, for example, mentioned as G77 plus China, or other groupings plus China, which is very, illuminating about how China sees herself, not within the global south, but in a sense overarching and leading the global south, not just in terms of diplomatic relations, but also within the UN system. And I think this is one of the most interesting, I would say, kind of messages, not results, because I think this is a very first step in a nice avenue of research that should be tackled in the future to understand how these formalities, after all, becomes the very substance of how interaction takes place, both bilaterally, collectively, and within the UN system, which we know has the power, whether we, accept it or not, to actually kind of write things in stone. So once you have something written in a resolution, there it is forever. And all subsequent resolutions have to stick to that. Also in glossaries. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. So we started to try to have an idea of what is important global south for China, and now we are trying to frame the China-Global South relation. So now I will turn to you, Jie, from Chatham House in London, and I will ask you to be a little bit more practical. So I will ask you, what are in practical way of looking, so the most important policies for the Global South from China? How do you see it?
Thank you, Filippo. Also, thanks so much again for ISPI to have invited me to speak in here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be with you in Milan. Such a shame. Lovely to see Elisa and yourself over there. So really delighted to be with you and share some of my thoughts on China's current policy towards the Global South. I think it's nothing really set in stone. I mean, for example, in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, you wouldn't really find a department referring as Department for Global South or Department for Developing Countries. But however, I think China's engagement with the Global South have really happened ever since the inception of the People's Republic back to 1949 to begin with. But really, I think the entire matter ticked it off from the turn of the century, from the beginning of the 21st century, since China joined WTO, then certain policies, certain development policies has been introduced for China's renewed engagement with Africa, with Latin America, and also with developing countries within China's neighborhood in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. So that really covered a lot of non-Western countries. I think what we can agree in here that even though the Western countries have a common identity and shared values and like-mindednesses, but I think Global South really is a loose collection of countries that willing and friendly towards China, and let's put it that way. Now, the two very key policies Beijing has issued in the recent years. The first one is the Belt and Road Initiative, which many of you are extremely familiar about it, and then Italy initially joined and then withdrew. So that's one thing. And the second policy, which now seems to be the diplomatic vocabulary for Beijing of the day, which is the Global Development Initiative, which takes some character of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, building infrastructures. But those infrastructures must be smaller in scale under the Global Development Initiative, firstly. And secondly, giving very strong focus on the digital element of the infrastructure, give a stronger focus on the scientific element of development assistance. So I think this is the Belt and Road Initiative and hence the Global Development Initiative, the two together are China's cornerstone of its engagement with the Global South. But nevertheless, I think what we need to add it in here is we need to really examine the whole matter on China's relationship with Global South in the what order, in the global order element. Essentially, what China is trying to do, it is trying to set itself, distinguish itself, a very different example compared with the United States. So United States is about bringing a military terms, showing its military might. However, for China's case, it's the case of the so-called economic development. I'm saying this as a description. I'm not saying this as a commentary. So that's the way how Beijing sees it. But when it comes to implementation, and obviously China's development policy and China's GDI and BRI have much of the Beijing's character and imprints in it, which is largely state-led. It is less about having the private companies, private sector, engaging with the Global South, but mostly it is a state-led behavior. And this has not changed in the last 70 years, I would say. So it's very much state-led and it's very much based on China's very own experience on development, especially on economic development. I think we have this very pertinent debate with the United Nations that in terms of rights, should really cherish the economic rights, which is something Beijing has given very strong emphasis towards too. Whereas on the other hand, you have countries from the G7 OECD countries advocating for the individual political rights should become as the priority. So I think that debate ranging on, and what this really lead to us? This lead to us in the more divided world between the global north and the global south. And what China is really keen to do is to set up an example that opposing what America has been doing. So it really, what we're talking about China's engagement with the global south is largely to do with the global order. It is largely to do with China's own experience of the economic development, but it's also largely to do with China's engagement in the multilateral institutions, which I'm sure other speakers are extremely well versed on the subject. So over to you. Thank you so much, Filippo.
Thank you. Actually, you mentioned, I think, two very important things, the BRI and GDI in this context. Actually, you also mentioned implementation. So about implementation, I will ask Linda Calabrese from ODI. So practically speaking, so how are these China's development policy doing? So where are the Chinese investing?
Sure. So thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be addressing this audience today. So I think what's very important from the viewpoint of the development policies is that we in the West, so Europe, US, whatnot, we consider development as something that has to do with poverty reduction, with improving the lives of women and girls, with inclusion and so on and so forth. And the viewpoint in China is extremely different, I think. And this is reflected in the way these development policies are designed, implemented. So what are the main development policies? So Yuji already mentioned what is the most prominent one at the moment, is Global Development Initiative, launched in 2021, announced in 2021 by President Xi Jinping. This includes both sort of traditional development elements, so a focus on poverty reduction, food security, response to pandemic, and so on, but also things that have more to do with economic development, so industrialization, digital economy, connectivity, and so on and so forth. Specifically for Africa, last year China announced 3 major initiatives, one for agriculture, one for industrial modernization, one for capacity building. So this all has to do with improvements, again, in economic development. So we see that the lines between development and economic growth are very blurred in the case of China. And we see that also at the micro level, in smaller initiatives. If we think about the agricultural technology demonstration centers that China set up across Africa, those are aid projects officially, but they also need to be financially viable. The Luban workshop, which are capacity building sort of technical and vocational training workshops. These are generally aid projects as well, but they may be set within Chinese special economic zones, so they are really closely linked to Chinese private companies. So we really see that mix between aid and development initiatives. Same within the Belt and Road. That's not officially a development policy as such, but it has a very strong development focus with the idea that development is really what is going to solve all problems. So we see a lot of these, blurred lines that we don't tolerate particularly well in the West, but I think China really embraces. And so, therefore, we cannot talk about China development policies without talking about its economic engagement with the Global South as well. Trade, investment, lending have grown massively in the past 20 years. And these go towards all sectors, really. If we think about Africa specifically, for example, China invests in a lot of sectors that have to do with economic development, extractives, construction, manufacturing, and so on. And this is extremely important in the view of the fact that the West doesn't necessarily invest in the same sectors apart from extractives, but not so much investment in infrastructure, not so much investment in industrialization either. So we really see that there's a slightly different focus, and there's a broader, I think, concept of development that China is offering in that sense, which is really, really important to understand how China engages the Global South.
Thank you, Linda. I think it's very important to really know exactly where investment are going in order to understand China's presence in the Global South, and also this is relevant in order to engage even China in the Global South. So I will turn again to Beijing, to He Jigao. You're an expert on EU-China relations. So I will ask you something, I would say, positive, optimistic. So the point is, where, if there is any places where in which China can cooperate inter countries in the Global South? Do you think there is any space for this cooperation, or we can see only competition in that? He Jigao, please.
Okay, thank you again. I'm so glad to hear more about development and not about the geopolitics. As I remember, this view of Global South research, I would say, starts from 2022, after the Ukraine war. I think the term is raised by the Giga, after the war. So the term is more about the geopolitics from my perspective. But now, in this conference, I heard lots about the development. So that's could be more possibility for China and Europe to cooperate, because China is the biggest developing country, and Europe is the biggest developed countries union. So that matters much, not only for global security and peace, but also for global development and stability. So that's why there are many cooperation, and especially for the leadership to communicate. For example, President Xi visited France, Hungary, and Serbia for the first 5 years. So that's why we could find some space to cooperation. Number one, we view Europe as the polar of international order. So we stress European integration, we pro European Union. So that's why we could find some common sense for cooperation. That's the first bottom line. Number two, we could find some third-party cooperation. We have read some papers from the European side, especially for the global G2B. in 2022, the flagship program covers many projects in, I would say, global South countries. That's why Global Gateway and Belt and Road Initiative could find some space to cooperation. Number 3, in terms of materialism, I would say there are many common language for China and Europe. Not use like, hegemony power. We could find cooperation to talk and discuss, to find some common ground. I think that's the mutual interest for China and Europe.
Thank you. Of course, this is one side of the coin of the situation we are living right now. Of course, competition is probably the one emerging the most right now, but still cooperation would be a point. But so I will turn to Alessia Meghini, asking you about the BRI and Global South, because actually the topic we just mentioned right now, so cooperation in third countries, was something even important when talking about BRI. So now my question is for you. Is BRI for the Global South effective from your point of view, or is just rhetoric? And I think this will also affect the way we might even cooperate in the future.
How many hours do I have?
4 minutes, 5.
Okay, 4 minutes. So now BRI is more than 10 years old. We used to welcome it as an infrastructure program, largely. What happened along the way, as we have recognized that it is much more than that. It's a kind of a format, kind of a canvas for a cooperative space, let's call it like this, encompassing a lot of areas. So, of course, transport, infrastructure are there, maybe less than before, for many reasons, of course, I'm not going into that. But the most important now chapters in Belt and Road are the financial cooperation chapter, with the RMB going abroad. If I can, make a reference to a policy back, referring to firms, Chinese firms going abroad. Now the RMB is going abroad, and this is going to hinge on financial cooperation chapters within the BRI memoranda signed with partners. This is a point that we are kind of under discussing, researching, but it's going very fast. And then the digital space also is included in BRI with what was called, I remember back in Beijing when the Belt and Road Forum, not the first Belt and Road Forum, when Italy was there, we were there, and now the third Belt and Road Forum was much less varied in terms of participation, so only close friends were actually there, not even one, well, just one European country was there, Hungary, this third time, unlike the first and the second. So the perception of BRI has been changing quite rapidly and quite significantly over the last 10 years. So it has become what it was intended to be since the very beginning, so a kind of a very large program of areas of cooperation. Finance and digital are very important. The renewable energy sector is also very much high on the agenda. Brackets, the nuclear energy is considered renewable, so you take it. I'm not commenting on that, but this is, of course, also a topic of discussion in Europe. So, to come to your question with these very, bullet points that I tried to share, it has been inclusive, kind of an ecumenic program, And it indeed was. But over time, the identity of BRI kind of shaped itself very clearly, much more than before, than at the very beginning. So countries were not very much, willing to share this, which is included in Chinese constitution. So it's a state of aim, to reach connectivity and to reach the ultimate aim of BRI, which is to link China to the rest of the world, digitally, financially, and of course, transport-wise, trade-wise, investment-wise, and so on. So maybe it's now a cooperative space, much closer and bigger, of course, now, because it's more than 155 countries, or, each and every day there is one more, so I don't know myself how many today. And also, what has been disregarded as a very important point is that more than 30 international organizations signed MOU on BRI. But international organizations are us, everybody, including World Health Organization, very many, up to 30 or even more, which is very significant of how, kind of BRI is capturing all the cooperative space, not only by China, but also globally. So it's a kind of very ambitious exercise that is continuing, accompanied by what you have been mentioning before, the global development, global security initiatives. And the very difference is considering the reputational loss of BRI, because it's very much divisive, right? So it's very confrontational for non-BRI countries, that those global development initiatives, global security initiatives have been born global directly. So they have not that kind of China-led label that the BRI had since the very beginning. And so they are more likely to be accepted as being kind of, inclusive, really inclusive. The BRI has been given this very, of course, because it has a Chinese hat.
Thank you, Alessia. So maybe we can also see the BRI as a way for China to institutionalize his policies for investing abroad, or, in generally speaking, his foreign policy. So I'm turning again to you, Jay. I want to ask you also about institutionalizing Global South. So we know, as Hojegao already mentioned, that probably 2022 is a very relevant year for Global South, and that is a year when BRICS summit in Beijing, virtually in Beijing, decided to enlarge BRICS. So, Jay, I'm asking you, what is the role for BRICS or other institutions what's the role? What role can they play for China's strategy toward the Global South?
Thank you, Filippo. Very important question. I do not necessarily consider BRICS has been the only channel that China is trying to institutionalize its engagement with the Global South. I think the most important institutionalized engagement that China has been doing this for years is the United Nations. Just look into the China's role in the United Nations, that has been the second largest fee contributor and have senior members in the management team of almost every single UN-led agency, and also trying to bring China's agenda incorporated into the UN SDG goals. So I think it's United Nations that actually China trying to institutionalize its relationship with engaging with many larger and small size Global South countries. So that's one thing. Now, secondly, I think regarding the expansion of BRICS, that's very different in purposes. I think the initial purpose was really a bunch of very similar emerging economy, of course, excluding Russia, because Russia's economic dimension are different from the other three, but nevertheless, Russia is there. And that was the beginning of the century. So the purpose of BRICS is very different from today, whereas the BRICS altogether, I think every individual member of BRICS have their own reason to be in that organization, but not exactly an economic one not exactly just about engagement with the global south, but instead, I think, for example, Brazil is more about enlarging its voice on the global platform, and Russia want to come across, not look to be isolated, given the current its invasion towards Ukraine. So, and India, of course, also want to compete with China in terms of the leadership with the global south, which next panel will discuss this extensively. So I think the BRICS, different members have different means and wants toward this organization. But China's role in here is simply, firstly, expanding the membership. And if we look into carefully examining the new added members, apart from Argentina, I think most of them are China-friendly. So it's in a way of countering the influence of the United States within various regions. I think, secondly, China also wants to put this into practice, that at the end of the day, it is not just China leading certain development initiative, but if we put all this in the context of an intergovernmental organization or multilateral organization, this would look like less likely to be China-led, but instead is the institutionalized initiative that proposed by multilateral organizations, which could somehow reducing the suspicion from the West towards China in terms of engaging with the global south. So I think these are the purpose for that. But I think nevertheless, we should also prompt into the question that when we're talking about China's engagement with the global south, China's engagement with the BRICS, then also with the UN, we should also asking about to what extent that China is able to sustain the same level of economic engagement with the global south for now, given the current domestic economic downturn. Because in the past 2 decades, what we have is we have a booming economy that is able to investing abroad, spending money abroad enormously. But I think all the spending spree must come to the end, as what I wrote for the Financial Times. China does need to find a new model, that more convincing model that engage with the global south, not just based on monetary terms, based on financial resources, but something go much deeper to engage with the global south. And it's not just about spreading and showering the money and pounds, but rather it's about winning the hearts and minds, which is much harder job for Beijing to do, I would say.
Thank you, Yuji. So again, I want to be practical again. So and ask Lina Calabrese to say a few things about one of the most controversial issue, I would say, whenever we deal with China and the global south. It is a debt issue. So what can you say about that? What's important debt issue for China and global south?
Thank you. Definitely, that is a very important and very divisive issue. I maybe want to raise 3 main points. So the first point is about the situation where we were and the situation where we are now. So a few years back, we were in a time where there were so many new emerging donors, emerging lenders. There were so many countries that were willing to lend to low and middle income countries. That sort of context was termed the age of choice, where it was thought that poor countries could have many partners compete, basically, to lend to them or to give them aid, and so they could get the best conditions. Of course, now, fast forward a few years, that situation has completely changed. China used to have a lot of money to lend because they had massive stimulus package from the financial crisis. That money is kind of decreasing, right? So we see less lending from Chinese policy banks. At the same time, we see the borrowers, so the countries who take the money, are in worse conditions to actually borrow because they've had the COVID crisis, they've had the price hikes from the Russia-Ukraine war. So the economic situation has deteriorated and countries are really not able to repay that debt. And many of them now wish they hadn't, borrowed so much. So I think we're in a very different situation compared to where we were a few years ago. And that's very important to note. The second point that's very important to note about that is the issue of the narrative. So the narrative, the debt trap narrative in particular with reference to China, is something that sticks very much. We've done some research at ODI on the risks of the Belt and Road Initiative. And when we were interviewing government officials, they were always telling us, we're so worried about borrowing from China now because they will grab a piece of our land if we don't pay them back. And this is the so-called debt trap narrative. And even if this has been debunked by very serious scholars now, it sticks. You still hear it being portrayed in the press. You still hear it in the discourses and narratives of policy officials. So I think what is very important here is not only to understand the reality, but also to understand the perceptions of the borrowing countries. And the last point I want to make in reference to that is that it's very difficult to make an argument for the global south, because you have very different countries within the global south in that respect. So in our research, for example, we interviewed officials in Cambodia. Cambodia has a very sound macroeconomic management framework. They don't really borrow anything that's not very concessional. So they don't borrow anything with higher interest rates, and that they feel they cannot pay back. At the same time, you have countries like Kyrgyzstan that have borrowed so much, and now, when the time has come to pay back, really struggle to do that. And they say they don't want to borrow any more from China, or maybe they can't borrow any more from China because they're not in the condition to do so. Geopolitics also matters when it comes to debt. If you compare the situation of two countries such as Sri Lanka and Pakistan, for example, they were both on the verge of a default. Sri Lanka did default and Pakistan didn't, because some allies of Pakistan came to the rescue and bailed it out with huge amounts of money, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia in particular, right? So the geopolitical situation and the geopolitical alliances that Pakistan had weaved helped it weather the storm, whereas Sri Lanka wasn't in that same condition. So this is all to say that we see very different positions with respect to that among countries in the global south, and it will be very difficult to find one solution that fits everyone and that really rallies the global south around one position on that. So it's very important to consider this when thinking about this issue.
Thank you, Linda. So narrative and reality, I think, are two very important points. So whenever dealing with debt issue in specific, but even with the global south, as you correctly mentioned, now we are taking global south as a unit, altogether. But actually, there are many differences on that. The point is, so we have to focus more and more. I think we already run out of time. If there is one question, maybe we can take it from the audience. Otherwise, I will just leave the floor to my colleague Nicola. But before leaving the floor to Nicola, I just want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you, Yujie, Senior Research Fellow on China Asia-Pacific Program, Chatham House. Thank you, Yujie. He Gao, Associate Professor, Institute of European Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Science. Thank you very much. Linda Calabrese, Research Fellow, International Economic Development Group, ODI, from UK, and of course our Alessia Ameghini, Professor at University of Eastern Piedmont, and of course co-head of the Asia Center here at ISPI. So thank you very much. It's now time for the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, and thanks to all of you for being here. We are now just starting the second session of this conference, and we are going to talk about an actor which, as our director Paolo said in the beginning, the world probably knows less than it does know China. Just a few words about the context. Economic competition, as we've seen, as well as the outbreak of the Ukraine war, have definitely contributed to tearing relations between China and the West. In this framework, however, where Beijing is increasingly presenting itself as a leader of the global South in opposition to advanced economies, to Western economies, the role of another actor has emerged strongly in recent years. As an equally vocal advocate of a different world order and of a more prominent role of the Global South in particular. That actor is India. Differently from China, however, India belongs both to groupings like the BRICS that demand a greater space for the former developing third world. But it is also a pillar of concepts of groupings like the Indo-Pacific, which are considered to be more Western aligned. Now, we're going to talk about what role New Delhi and India can play in this framework, and which future the different blocs in the Pacific, the BRICS, may have. We have roughly 40 minutes to dive into these topics, and maybe some time for Q&A. And please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers. I will start with Tanvi Madan. Welcome, Tanvi. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Philippe Lecor, who is a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in France, politics at the ESSEC Business School. And Professor Amitendu Palit, as well, a senior research fellow and a research lead in trade and economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University in Singapore. Welcome to you all. I think I will just start off with you, Philip. China's struggle for leadership in international relations in general and in the Global South is often described by the West mainly as a revisionist position, aiming to rally allies for a radical change in the current Western-led international system. India also advocates for changes in this system, and I would like to ask you, how do the two visions of this change compare between the two countries?
So obviously, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here and glad that Asia Society is well positioned in that conference. So thank you to Filippo and to everyone. And very nice to see distinguished fellow panelists as well. Some of them I know very well, Tanvi. To answer your question, Nicola, I think obviously the war in Ukraine has changed the situation a great deal. When I spent a few years in Washington, in fact at Brookings and various other institutions, and the idea that Russia and China would be both revisionist powers was somewhat questioned by some of the China specialists, sorry about that. And but of course the war in Ukraine has sort of put them together, so to speak, and especially for the past 2 years since Russia has been counting on the help of China for its adventurous policies in Ukraine. When it comes to India, now obviously India is presenting itself as a voice of reason. When you compare with what we've been hearing about in the previous panel, how China has been portrayed, particularly in the West, as a fairly aggressive power, especially in connection with its close partnership with Russia. India wants to perhaps play the game a little bit more. But of course, it's also a member of the international organizations that we've been talking about. But it is trying to be, as Foreign Minister Jaishankar said, it is trying to be non-West, but not anti-West. I think that's a big difference. Now, of course, we heard, a Chinese speaker just earlier, talking about hegemons and that Europe and China perhaps should fight against hegemon. This is not really a language of peace in itself, because we know what China is meaning by that. But India is more, at least is presenting itself in a more positive manner. It's addressing global challenges. Now, obviously, when it comes to the alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, China is sort of sitting in the middle at the moment. India has come up with some ideas during the G20, the India-Middle East corridor, for example. But so far, a number of geopolitical issues are interrupting this move. So there's obviously, we are in the middle of a big shift, and India is trying to present itself as a more, West-friendly global power in the global arena. That's how I see it, especially vis-à-vis Europe. When you think about the Resina dialogue that took place in February, for example, you had, 10 foreign ministers from Europe. It was very much, engaging with Europe as a possible partner. So when it comes to Europe, both India and China are competing for friendship and possibly alliances. But so far, there is certainly on the Chinese side more moves that have been made, including the BRI, including Chinese investments, and I think India is perhaps waiting also for the result of the ongoing general elections to step in and come up with some alternatives. But so far, I would say, the outcomes are not so obvious.
Thank you so much. And maybe India is waiting for its own elections and for our elections as well next week. By the way, the results in India and the elections in Europe will coincide next week. So we've been talking about the relations towards the West, China's vision and India's vision in international relations. However, Tanvi, I will get to you. India has emerged over the last couple of years as a very prominent voice, not only in international relations, but it is claiming a significant voice in the global South itself. But at the same time, India is a member of groupings like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the so-called Quad, which is comprises Western powers, and it has very good relations not only with Europe but increasingly with the United States as well. So, what role does India want to play within the global South?
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you to ISPI and Asia for taking part. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you, and particularly with Amitendra and Philippe on the panel, who I've learned a lot from. I think, one of the things that India is doing in some ways is it's not suddenly burst onto the scene of working with the countries or the groupings we call the Global South now. It's rediscovering and reclaiming the voice it's long sought to have. And so we're almost at the 70-year anniversary of the Bandung Summit, which was held in 1955, which actually came out of similar instincts. It was officially called the Afro-Asian Summit, the Summit of African and Asian countries. And so you saw that phase of India. It eventually went into the non-aligned movement. India participated and part of G77 discussion. And so this is more a reclaiming, and I think it's important to make that point that it's India's participation in thinking about the developing world is not new. It is rediscovering it. It is becoming more prominent in India's discourse, but it has been a reality. And that's because of a reason. This is where I think India is different. I think the previous panel, somebody mentioned that China approaches the global south as G77 plus China. India sees itself as part of the global south. It's not just G77 plus India. It sees itself as a developing country. There are parts of India that could be developed countries, but there are large parts of India that are still developing as well. And so India, it doesn't see itself in terms of an outsider. It sees itself as a global south country. It is seeking to be a voice of this grouping. It is seeking also to be a bridge between the global south and the north, so a north-south, but also east-west on some issues. So you've heard Indian officials say, India is east, it is west, it is north, it is south, and it's seeking to be a bridge between kind of different views on these subjects. Now, this is a shift for India that in the past, particularly in the G77 phase that India went through in the 70s and 80s, was sometimes thought of as a barrier between the North and South. And now you've seen that shift, and I'll come to why, and it has a lot to do with China, but also India's own role in the world today and its own power and position. But you're seeing India seek to play this bridging role. And one of the reasons for that is, unlike China and Russia, as Philippe talked about them as revisionist powers, India doesn't seek to revise the international order, but it does seek to reform the international order. And it wants to do this not just for itself, but what it sees as for the developing world as well. And in two ways. It wants greater representation, and it wants greater reflection of global South issues. And let me just break those down. In terms of representation, it wants to see a larger voice, more seats at the table in various international institutions or groupings for developing countries, particularly for itself, but for others as well. And so that's a representation element. But then there's the reflection aspect. It wants to see these international multilateral discussions reflect their agendas, really reflect issues and viewpoints that reflect the needs of the global South. And so you saw this during the G20, where India put forward, when it was hosting last year the summit, putting forward agenda items like development financing, like food, fuel, energy, fuel and fertilizer security issue, health, greater distribution kind of health resources, but also kind of climate justice in a very different way. It doesn't necessarily reflect the same views as the West has, but it's trying to kind of find a meeting ground. So I think it is that one kind of one additional point on kind of how India sees these global South issues and how it sees its role. While India is doing this because it thinks that the developing world needs a greater voice, India is taking this role again today because it sees the global South, the developing world, in its own interest. So there's a very pragmatic, realist reason for India to take this role as well. And that's because the developing world plays a key role vis-a-vis kind of India's four larger objectives. It's security, it's prosperity. We're seeing not just the Indian government, but Indian companies now seek to invest, for example, in the global South. So it sees these developing countries as part of, somebody, I think it was Linda Calabresi in the last panel said, it doesn't just see the developing world as a challenge, it sees the developing world as an opportunity as well economically. So in terms of India's own security, in terms of prosperity, but also in terms of strategic autonomy for India, and India taking a rightful place on the global stage, sees the developing world, their role in international institutions, their membership, for example, of the UN, as important And therefore, it also sees it as important that it's not just China that holds sway, China, which is India's rival at the moment in India's mind, leading the strategic challenge. India does not want to leave this space for China alone. And so I think it's key for India that the global south is not just a kind of a nice to have set of partnerships, but a must have for India's own objective, the challenges for India, that it is a very diverse set of countries that has diverse relationships with India, but also has differences with India. Some countries have differences with India on the West, Israel, and on China as well. And finally, that India does not have alone the resources to compete with China with these countries, given its own needs as well, but needs partnerships to work with partners.
Thank you, Tanvi. And speaking about prosperity and engagement with other countries, let's be practical, as Filippo suggested. And I would like to ask you, Professor Palit, so in which fields practically is the India-China competition unfolding right now? Given especially that India's economic influence is smaller than China's, what leverage does India have over other countries in the global south, and how do initiatives like the now 10 years old BRI from China and other initiatives like the International Solar Alliance or the IMEC by India compare?
Yeah. Thank you so much, and let me begin by thanking ISPI, Filippo, Nicola, all of you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Lovely to see you, Tanvi, online. Wish you could have been here today. You know, Nicola, I think it's unfortunate that in practically every aspiration that India today exercises by way of being an economy or a developing entity, it needs to factor in China. And I think the context to that was very nicely explained by Tanvi, because it's not just a question of India thinking of China as a global power or as a global actor. There's a history to it, and India probably has the deepest historical understanding of China in a sense, which has flown over centuries and decades, and it has taken various kinds of twists and turns to actually now be at a position which is very complicated and innately competitive. It's very difficult to think of any anti-competitive contexts in any strategic role that India takes in terms of global and regional policies with respect to China. And as you mentioned, perhaps if we had been having this conversation 10 years before, we would have spoken about issues like India and China competing for a greater share of global markets. They definitely do so now also, but within that understanding, the idea has changed. Today, that share of global market is not just an abstract idea in terms of percentages, but it is going to be focused on industries and sectors which bring economic influence of a kind that also brings geopolitical influence. So let's say, for example, when we look at industries that are going to drive the world, and industries that are predominantly important from the global south community and the global family. Obviously, we cannot ignore infrastructure. Infrastructure will continue to remain an area of competition between China and India, but then again, one also needs to perhaps look at this in the context of how infrastructure will be a factor that will be determining the competition. We know for sure that the financial capacities of the two countries don't match. And you alluded to BRI. China, by that yardstick, is far ahead, not just of India's, but practically of most other countries of the world, including in the G7, in its ability, in its sheer scale to finance infrastructure projects. But I think this is where there's a problem that we need to appreciate. Scale has a downside. The downside to scale, to large scale, is that it cannot always ensure quality. It cannot always bring in uniform benefits. And we have seen that in a large number of cases because China's advance economically across the world has also brought with it questions of quality, questions of subsidies that has supported its development in fairly covert ways in number of times. I think this is where India has understood this problem pretty early on, and it has understood the fact that what matters for countries in the long run is commitment to standards and lasting solutions that will deliver the benefits for generations. So, for example, when it comes to issues like, let's say, for example, infrastructure as a whole, when it comes to hard infrastructure, I don't think India is going to take on China on a one-by-one basis as an exporter of capital into infrastructure projects, but it's going to work with other countries. And there are enough examples in that respect. It's going to work with Europe. There is the India-EU third country infrastructure partnership, which has already been around. But more importantly, I think the intentions that India expressed are pretty much clear, that if you look at an initiative like the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, let's not forget the fact that this is where India is working with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, who incidentally are also members of the BRICS at this point in time. So it's not a question of India actually shying away from countries who are technically, aligned with China in some respect or close to China in that some respect. I think India does not express a reservation in that regard. But what's very important in that respect is a project like IMEC vis-a-vis the BRI focuses on two things. First, standards and transparency. Second, it provides collective security to infrastructure, which is a very important point to note because today across the world, infrastructure has become vulnerable to security risks. It's not just a question of infrastructure, multi-country infrastructure suffering from supply chain disruptions, but these disruptions have got connected to terrorist activities. They have got connected to various kinds of security issues and also climate change issues. So I think that's where what India realizes is that it's just not important to throw in an infrastructure combo at the recipients just because they can be available at takeaway prices. What is important is to ensure the quality of the package that is being offered in a longer term perspective. And that's where India also realizes it's impossible to guarantee that on one's own. It has to be brought in partnership with countries which are standard setters across the world. And that's where you see a group from within the G7 coming together and also from within the emerging countries coming together to create partnerships like the IMEC, which are very effective. And alongside that, there are also areas which again connected to infrastructure, exceptionally important from the global south. For example, the way they ensure that welfare benefits spread to the maximum. So something like the digital public infrastructures, the way they're being conditioned for inclusive delivery of benefits, a line that India very actively championed during its G7 presidency, the DPI exports and so on and so forth. And the last point that I'd like to mention in this regard is that across the global south, there is a crisis insofar as availability of quality human resource is concerned. The human resource gap is becoming very challenging. And I think that's where India has decided to play as constructive a role as possible by becoming, if I could loosely describe it as educator of educators, by deploying people to actually pick up the right skills and training and make them capable.
Thank you so much. So India is moving forward in its quest for leadership and for engagement with the world. Now, Philippe, how does China see this emerging role of India? Does it actually feel the pressure of China, of India being a new regional or global leader, and how is it reacting to it?
So when you look at, the China-India relationship over the past 10 years, I think it's already been mentioned a few times. There was a time when Chairman Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi were actually, in close cooperation, I would say. At least they had, bilateral exchanges. The BRICS was obviously a venue for that. The G20 was another one. Now, we have all noticed that Mr. Xi attended the BRICS summit, but did not attend the G20 in Delhi last year. That speaks volumes for the situation. But generally, when I speak to Chinese interlocutors about India, I can see at least, I would say, unease or jealousy sometimes, perhaps the word, perhaps it's a strong word, but somebody, Yujie was talking about winning hearts and minds. I think India is pretty good at winning hearts and minds. Now, we have to be careful because, the West, as we all know, especially Europe, is in deep trouble. So we have to be careful who we are actually, having dinner with. I'm thinking of a few other countries that, have suddenly appeared as, the next China, or as alternatives to this country, China, where multinationals from all over the world, especially the United States and Europe, have been investing and doing business with. As we know, this is now shifting, and a number of regions and countries are now thinking where to go next. Where is the next China? Now, is the next China in Southeast Asia? Is it in Latin America, or is it in India? So, 10 years ago, big Chinese companies were still very active in India. Thinking of Huawei, for example, that was developing 4G networks. Thinking of Alibaba, I think was quite active. And there were a number of projects, including in infrastructures, that were conducted by Chinese companies in India. And generally, the mood was not as competitive as it is now. Now, these days, again, the reaction from China is that, perhaps, it has to do with numbers a little bit. And obviously, the economic growth of India has been 6.5%. It's probably higher than China's. The demographic growth is no doubt, in this category, India is also winning. And thirdly, this is a year where 50% of the world's adult population is voting. The fact that India, being the world's biggest democracy, even though there are issues with the BJP, which I won't go into, but the fact this such a massive country is again talking about hearts and minds and things like that, and having in a world where so many divisions, so many conflicts, ideological conflicts, but military conflicts as well, in Europe as well as in the Middle East and possibly in East Asia, one day, sooner or later, means that India is providing this alternative. At the same time, India is also part of the this new world of securitization. It is investing a lot in defense. It is buying, military equipment, not just from the United States, but from Russia, from France, from Japan. It's cooperating with everyone. So it is something that China is not really able to do, because China is projecting itself as a big power that wants to get back into its position of a big power, which it had for many centuries, and of course it's seeing India as the one that is going to perhaps counterbalance China's power in Asia, and it's been trying to contain this power instead of cooperating with India by, helping, working with Pakistan, which of course has been going on a long time, working with the Maldives, working with Sri Lanka, countries that are close to India but are not, of course, run by India. And globally, it shows that China is wary of India's rise as a global power. At least that's how I see it.
Thank you. And I'm going to reverse the question maybe for Tanvi. We've seen how China is perceiving India's rise. But how is India actually perceiving its own competition with China within the Global South specifically, and within groupings that comprise both countries, like the BRICS, even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or even the G20?
I think, Nicola, if you had asked me this question 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, the answer would have been very different. I think you've seen kind of India see competition or kind of China vis-a-vis the developing world in a very different way today than it did before. And that's a reflection of how India sees China more broadly today than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago. I think earlier you saw a stage where on the multilateral stage, you often saw India and China cooperating on issues like trade, like climate change, like even non-proliferation, like cyber governance. You saw, and development finance, kind of the reform of the multilateral development banks or representation, number of seats for India and China on kind of the global governance institutions, including global economic governance institutions. You saw them cooperating. Today, you are seeing India compete, as Amitendra said, with China in every one of those domains and in various regions in the developing world and more broadly. Because I think India sees China just more competitively given the border crisis, but not just the border crisis that they have. India thinks it has a fundamentally different vision for the region, for the Indo-Pacific, Asia, whatever your preferred term is. India thinks China wants a unipolar Asia where Beijing gets to set the rules. India says it wants a multipolar Asia where countries are free to make their own choices. And so you see within that context that today India sees China in competitive ways in terms of being making offerings for, and Amitendra, I think, talked about standards, very important, but also not just investing in countries economically, but using its economic influence either through persuasion or coercion to shape countries' strategic choices, not just vis-a-vis India, but vis-a-vis, for example, Western countries in some cases, and vis-a-vis the international order. And so this use of China, of its economic influence for diplomatic, military, other political leverage, India sees China intervening now in the political affairs of various neighbors. India like to reserve the right for that sometimes itself, but these things are causing concern in India. And so India, I think, recognizes that what happens, particularly in kind of the Indo-Pacific, in India's Indo-Pacific, so, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, that rim, that Indian Ocean rim particularly matters for India's interests, and it needs to provide alternatives to what China is offering. And as we mentioned before, and Amitendra did as well, because of the capabilities gap between China and India, that India cannot do it alone. Just one statistic. About 30 years ago, India and China's economies were the same size. Today, China's economy is 5.5 times that of India. Now, because of the trends Philippe mentioned, that gap will close, or at least that will stop widening, but you're going to see that gap continue for a while. And so I think you're seeing in India that sees China more competitively, as it did, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, but also that means that it will look for partners, as was just mentioned. One other thing just about kind of the BRICS and the SCO and some of the other groupings. You did see India as a member of BRICS. It's a member of the Russia-India-China trilateral, though that has not met at the summit level for a number of years now, more to do with India-China tensions. And it's the second largest shareholder of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So India did see common cause with China at a time, and that these memberships were a reflection of that time and were a reflection of India seeking non-Western platforms. But as India sees some of these organizations, and particularly Russia, India, China trilateral, but also within BRICS, one of the concerns India will have is that Russia, its traditional partner, instead of helping it dilute China's influence in these groupings, that Russia and China are not seeing these as non-West organizations, but trying to make them anti-West voices. You will see India resist that. And it will do so, for example, in BRICS, with perhaps other countries, like-minded countries, as Amitendra mentioned, including potentially the Saudis and the Emiratis and even Brazil and South Africa. There's a subgrouping of BRICS called IPSA. So I think you're seeing a lot more fluidity and complexity to India's memberships of these groupings. India spends a lot of times in BRICS summits taking out endorsements, consensus endorsements of the BRI formerly and now GDI and others. But it will not leave these organizations because, for one thing, it will not want to leave a vacuum for China and to some extent for Russia to make these groupings anti-Western voices. And India will want to shape the agenda of these institutions. Just one final point, just to add to something Philippe said. You know, one of the things I think India recognizes that it is a battle of hearts and minds, but it's also a battle for stomachs. And at the end of the day, we as like-minded countries, and I think this is a common shared interest of India and the West, have to make alternative offerings. We can't just say what China is offering is bad. I think there's that recognition. But I think there's also this understanding that one of the biggest, this is the hearts and minds part, or the mind spot. One of the biggest challenges that India poses to China is if it is an effective democracy and can develop, it disproves the argument that China made at one point that China's model was the most successful for development. So India can show the development and democracy are not mutually exclusive. And to me, that ideological challenge is actually potentially the most threatening to China if India can succeed in doing it.
Thank you so much. And going back to hard geopolitics, the concept of the Indo-Pacific has been gaining traction over several years now, and the West, especially the US, is massively investing in securitizing the region, India as well. I would like to ask you, Amitendra, what role does the Indo-Pacific play in the China-India competition?
Look, Nicola, I think let's look at it this way. The Indo-Pacific did come into a significant amount of strategic understanding from about 15 years ago. From the time when the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had actually articulated it in an address to both houses of the Indian Parliament, the confluence of the two oceans. The point is that from there onward, for about 10 years, this was more or less a dormant concept, and it's only over the last 5 to 6 years it became very active. And that clearly has much to do with the US-China major power rivalry. But when it comes to India specifically, I think India, in this respect, did not hesitate to show up to the point that for Indo-Pacific at least, it considers itself very strongly embedded into the concept as a strategic actor. There are two things that happen which I think is worth noting. The first is, when one looks at regional architectures, the only competing regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific geography from an economic sense is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which, while being an ASEAN-driven agreement, also has 5 other major economies, including China. Now, the fact that India stayed out of it was essentially largely, there were economic reasons that conditions India's decision, but it was also primarily because of the fact that India could not actually undertake to the commitment of getting into a free trade agreement with China for all practical purposes. But on the other hand, it did not hesitate to join the conversation on an Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is being led by the United States. And this is notwithstanding the fact that India and the US have remarkable differences on trade issues and economic issues. These are outstanding. But the point is, and this is again, I think, largely shaping into the development democracy idea that Tanvi proposed. I think India is trying to make it very clear that talking about the global south does not mean disengaging with the West. You work on both together because there are benefits to be obtained from that collective partnership. If you today, for example, look at the Indo-Pacific economic framework, it has the G7 members actively involved in it. It has US and Japan, it has OECD countries, and it also has low-income economies from the region which are working into it. There is clearly, again, this issue that when it comes to a region like the Indo-Pacific, there is today the idea of a rules-based framework which is shaping there, but it hasn't happened in any other sphere where China might be considered a dominant force. For example, if you look at the BRICS, well, the BRICS has not been able to move into the idea of rule-making. And it is not possible also because that agenda which will come out of a rule-making idea must accept some kind of leadership which can be circumspect, but which at least needs to be left unchallenged. That is something which has happened with respect to Indo-Pacific. I think India has made it very clear that it is happy to work with the United States, providing directions on at least economic rulemaking in that regard, and it is equally happy to work with another group of middle powers which it considers to be in the same category as itself: Japan, Australia, Indonesia. And many of them have relations with China which are very different from the way India has its relations with China, but that does not deter the idea of working together in making a region as holistically productive and inclusive as possible.
Thank you. We have a little less than 10 minutes left, so I would like to ask you a last set of questions. In order to look at this India-China competition from the outside, let's say. So Philip, please short answers now, so we might have some time for Q&A in the end. My question is about Europe in the India-China competition. India is increasingly, Europe is increasingly looking at India as a potential partner. It has published its own Indo-Pacific strategy. Yet the relationship between Europe and China is quite different from the relationship between Washington and China. It is maybe less competitive. So how do you think Europe should navigate this competition between India and China for global and regional leadership?
Working? Yeah, it is. I think 2019, you refer to the European elections and the fact there are Indian elections going on at the moment. There have been many elections this year. 2019 was an important year. This was the previous European elections. This is also when the current European Commission was established, and that's when Ursula von der Leyen mentioned the word geopolitics, which was almost a bad word in Europe before, and now everybody talks about that. Europe, since 2019, has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. It has come up with a triptych regarding China, calling China different things: a partner, a competitor, a systemic rival. It hasn't been so sophisticated on India, but I think it's still thinking about it. But as Amitendo said, India is part of Indo-Pacific. So as far as Europe is concerned, there is a renewed interest on Asia as a whole, and it goes from the Indian Ocean all the way to the South Pacific, and this is another area where China and others, mainly the United States and its allies, are competing. I wouldn't say India is a big player in the South Pacific. There is certainly a renewed interest. The fact we are in this very room shows that the Indo-Pacific has become a top priority for Brussels. We mentioned earlier the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, and these are not rule-setting organizations. The rule-setting organizations are the UN, possibly, but the UN has also become this arena where powers are exerting influence or blocking the Security Council with, resolutions that, that would condemn Russia's attacks or things like that, or Gaza, and mainly led by Russia and China. And the General Assembly of the UN is certainly not as efficient as it used to be. But there are other organizations where I think now, obviously, India would be interested in joining the Security Council, but as we know, it's not going to be easy with China probably blocking this idea or even entertaining it. But there are other organizations, I'm thinking of the World Bank and the IMF, where we all know that the South, I wouldn't use the word global South, but the South is not well represented or not represented at the right level. So this is, these are certainly organizations that can work with a number of countries, and we know that China, I remember from my time in Washington that China is not happy with the weight it has at the World Bank, and it has somewhat given up, and this has led to the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example. But I don't think India has given up. I think India has actually increased its presence at the World Bank. So this is where I would say, and WTO, WHO, other organizations where China is still present, but somewhat is building an alternative set of organizations, not always successfully and not always rule-setting, to use Professor Palit's word. But there's still some scope in the international arena where particularly Europe and India can cooperate.
Thank you, Philip. And Tanvi, since you are based in the United States, we all know that the US has been devoting increasing attention and partnership with India. But what I'm missing, what is the long-term aim in the United States relationship with India right now?
I think there's a broader theory of the case in the US about India, and this has been across administrations. So I would say starting towards the end of the Clinton administration, through very different administrations in the US, very different presidents, of course. The idea that, India a rising India will be more powerful in various domains, across kind of functional domains, economic, technology, military, etc. But it also will have, by its sheer heft, help shape the balance of power in the region and globally, and that it will, in kind of the regional and global domains, that its voice and where it speaks to what kind of who it aligns with will matter for U.S. interests. And so, engaging India, an India that either could benefit or, if it works at cross purposes, hinder US objectives, diplomatic, military, technological, economic objectives, engaging with India is crucial for that reason. Within this broader kind of theory of the case for engaging with India, and there's a matching theory of the case that India has about the US, but within that, there is also convergence on China to some extent, convergence on the Indo-Pacific more broadly, but also a shared concern that the US has with India on not China's rise per se, but rising China's assertive behavior in kind of bilaterally vis-a-vis India and the US, but also in the region and globally. And so what you've seen is that convergence. And from the US point of view, India serves as or potentially could serve as a geopolitical counterbalance, an economic alternative, a more trusted technology partner, and a democratic contrast to China. And that's been the theory of the case vis-a-vis China. What that convergence on China has done is facilitate cooperation from the US perspective with India across domains, diplomatic, economic, military, technology. We have not seen a US-India relationship that's closer. But it's also meant that it has incentivized the US and India to manage their differences, which continue to exist on whether it's on China, including, for instance, India and China actually share a view on developing non-dollar trading mechanisms. So they're not exactly, a consensus view between the US and India and China. There's a very different view of a partnership with Russia, for instance, but there's also differences on some differences continuing on Pakistan. But there's also obviously US concerns about kind of domestic dynamics in India. But despite these differences, you've seen kind of that shared convergence on China between the US and India, on convergence on the Indo-Pacific more broadly, essentially lead to cooperation, and not just bilateral, but regional and global. And let me just give you two instances of this, very real instances, just to make a final point, so it's real and not just abstract. Just yesterday, the US and India, along with their fellow Quad countries, Australia and Japan, in Geneva, on the sidelines of the World Health Assembly, host a event on more open digital public infrastructure solutions. That's to what Amitendu said earlier. So kind of actually coordinating and working collaboratively in this space. Another very real example for the US and India, the US has a development finance corporation. It is, which is the kind of development finance mechanism that the US has. It is financing an Indian company's efforts to develop a port in Sri Lanka, in part to give Sri Lanka that alternative to Chinese offerings. This is not just abstract cooperation. We're seeing coordination at the UN, but also on the ground in these infrastructure spaces in a way that you didn't see in the past.
Thank you so much. One last question for you. We've been talking about the two giants, India and China, the United States, Europe. But how is this unfolding competition between India and China seen in the region? Tanvi has been mentioning Sri Lanka, but there are several other countries where this competition is going to unfold in the next years.
I think there are two sides to it. The first is that yes, there is a degree of tension. There's always this tension that perhaps the India-China rivalry might sometimes take ugly turns, which it did 3-4 years ago in terms of loss of lives on the border, and that might impact the region as a whole in terms of the collateral damage, movement of goods, heightened security, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there is also this quiet feeling of, I would say, relief on part of many countries, small countries, because they do realize that both China and India are, quote unquote, investing in them in a variety of ways, trying to bring them closer. For example, a country like Sri Lanka is one where both China and India have been active in a very large number of ways, and India is beginning to show that it's not just a question of the India-Sri Lanka relationship being confined to cricket, but there's much more than the game of cricket in that relationship. And there's a lot that has been brought on the table. It has happened with Nepal, it has happened with other countries. But here, I think there is one important issue to be noted, that at the end of the day, China is a country which probably looks at things from a perspective which is also conditioned by the relationship it has with the United States. So that's another factor that comes into play over here. India doesn't look at things that way. India primarily would look at the relationship between its own neighbors and the second tier of neighbors in Southeast Asia and so on and so forth, in a somewhat more looser fashion and be able to focus on a few specifics that much more. Let's say, for example, on the point that Tanvi mentioned, I think it's very important that, Tanvi, you raised it. When we have looked at regional health partnerships, I mean, in the context of COVID, and thereafter the question of healthcare providers as well as health service providers, clearly these are areas where India has been able to connect much more closely with the neighbors in a way than China has been able to. The second is that there are some things which probably the relatively smaller countries want but can't access. You know, the ability to access markets, bigger markets, regional markets, sometimes those things happen very quickly through certain solutions that are provided without much fuss. That's something that India is trying to do through its digital finance operability platforms. And probably these are the areas where the Indian focus has been that much more better and much more effective, because it has not had to think about the US factor in this regard, which China has had to and will have to keep thinking, because China has to walk a space which is exclusive of the US. India doesn't have to do that. So in a sense, it becomes easier.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but this game is unfolding and probably ongoing for the next several decades. So we are going to have more occasions to talk about that. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Tanvi Madan from Brookings, Professor Philippe Lecor, from the Asia Society France, which I'm thanking for their partnership, and Amitendu Palit. Thank you so much for the discussion.